All right. Hello, everybody. Today we'll be talking about a book by Agatha Christie, a Hercule Poirot novel, kind of. This one is called The Clocks, and I happened to have a meeting with some people over in a library last month, I guess. And I went through the whole stacks, and this was the only book that I found in the whole stacks that I really wanted to read. So I read part of it while I was waiting for them to show up. Now, this is a book that was apparently published in 1963. Now, every official source that I can find, including Agatha Christie, her own, legacy website, not a state website, right? It said that this book was published in 1963. It was serialized and it was published as a novel. The funny thing is that the version that I found, which was, one of those nice library book edition versions on archive.org, the version that I found says that Christie's copyright on the clocks was 1958, which, and the book itself seems like it was published on or around 1975 because there were illustrations that were added to the book that had their own their own independent copyright date. So that's a weird thing. Probably just a typo of that book. They messed up and said it was different, but it's very weird to find an Agatha Christie book where its own lineage has some kind of a mystery involved. But anyway, let's get to it. This is advertised as a Poirot novel, but he is not treated very well, and we don't get to enjoy a lot of his presence in this particular book. Instead, we get two different protagonists, a guy named Colin Lamb and a detective inspector named Hardcastle. Now, a while back, I did a review of a book called Destination Unknown from 1954. This was another Agatha Christie book, but this one wasn't a mystery. It was supposed to be basically like a spy thriller. And it wasn't a particularly good one either. Agatha Christie is not nearly as good at coming up with cool spy thriller ideas and making things exciting and intriguing as opposed to coming up with really cool ideas for murders that are difficult to solve. This is a book that tries to combine them both, and it doesn't work very well. I mean, maybe the idea was that she thought that if she added a bunch more of her kind of vague spycraft stuff, that would draw in readers, I guess, but I mean, this is not some random author we're talking about. We're talking about Agatha freaking Christie, right? You could just write another murder mystery by Agatha Christie on a book and put it on a shelf, and people are going to go for that. You don't need to put in this Cold War gibberish that isn't actually thrilling and isn't actually interesting and isn't actually fun to make an Agatha Christie murder mystery sell, is my impression. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the people in, the late 50s were like, no, we need that element in the story or else everything is doomed. I don't know. So, just to kind of set the stage for this story, we have a stenographer who is sent to a house. She finds there a man who is dead, and there is a very strange set of circumstances that appears around this dead man that creates a pretty decent sounding mystery to start. We have some fairly typical Agatha Christie kind of trappings. Enigmatic clues, details of importance that are missing, a bunch of people whose testimony contains, some lies, some misunderstandings, some simple omissions, right? For our two protagonists, we have Colin Lamb, where his voice is, I would say it's kind of like an Agatha Christie's impression of a young man. He's very inquisitive, he's very energetic, he's also but he's also got a romantic streak to him as well. Detective Inspector Hardcastle's voice, and we kind of switch between these two voices throughout the story. At one point we're listening to Colin Lamb's narrative, another point we're getting Hardcastle's narrative. In fact, the book is labeled that way occasionally, which is another issue with the book. It's kind of organized in a little weird way. There's chapters, but then there's also subchapters, and then in addition to subchapters, there's also these places where the narrative switches. And, Christie is very clear, this is Colin Lamb's narrative, this is Detective Hardcastle's narrative, this is not anybody's narrative, and here's chapter 4. It got on my nerves a little bit, I'll just say that. So, Lamb's voice is Agatha Christie's young man voice. He's very inquisitive and curious, he's got a lot of energy, he wants to get to the bottom of this mystery, but he's also treating it as kind of a game, right? Where he's not super interested in solving the mystery, and in fact, certain possible solutions to the mystery, he's kind of like, no, that can't possibly be it because of that romantic streak. Fair enough. Detective Inspector Hardcastle is older and more sedate. His tone is a little bit more police procedural than detective story, and he is thorough and curious, though he's more kind of reserved about his curiosity than Lamb. There are a lot of times in the book where Hardcastle will be talking to someone and they'll say something, and he'll in the narrative it'll be like, oh, he'll have a quote. I wanted to say this, but I didn't because I thought that by not saying this I would get better information out of this witness. There are a lot of moments where Hardcastle holds his tongue about something that he thinks might be telling or a clue, and he's very good at not letting the person that he's interviewing know where his cards are, so to speak. Lamb is a little bit less, what would you call it? Like, crafty sounding, I guess. But at the same time, he is crafty as a character, but we find that out a little bit later. Now, this book, when I saw it, it was advertised as a Hercule Poirot book, a mystery, right? But the fact of the matter is that we don't actually see Poirot for almost half the book. In fact, the first time we hear Poirot's name mentioned, someone's like, "Wasn't he dead?" And Colin is like, "No, he wasn't dead. He's not dead. He's fine." One of the great things about the Poirot books is kind of his treatment of things, the way that he thinks, the way that he talks, the way that he is always kind of making these little pellets of wisdom for you. If you've ever read, I've read a decent number of Poirot novels. I didn't go back and look at which ones I read to kind of come up with a thing, but you've got the Murder on the Orient Express. There's a bunch of books where Poirot is working with that guy Hastings, who's kind of the Dr. Watson to the Hercule Poirot. In this book, we get very little of Poirot's characteristic charm. He's kind of prideful, but he's also charming. He's a little eccentric, but he always has something interesting and fun to say. And we get almost none of that in this book. He appears, I think, 3 times in the book for a couple of pages a pop, and that's basically it. And in this particular book, Hastings isn't around. He's off gallivanting in South America, and it's very weird because Colin Lamb is treated as kind of like Poirot refers to him as like a retriever, like a dog who's bringing something to Poirot that he hopes will please him. But at the same time, Lamb is seems to be very unfamiliar with Poirot's methods, right? Like, if you've read enough Poirot books, you know that he drinks weird things, hot chocolate or syrup black currant syrup de cassis, I believe, is what he calls it. But at the same time, when Lamb goes to see Poirot and Poirot is drinking something weird like hot chocolate or syrup de cassis or mineral water or whatever, Lamb is like, he's so weird about the things that he drinks, whereas someone who had a long acquaintance with Poirot would have been used to this by now and not really mentioned it to the reader, so to speak. In fact, he would have something else to say where, one time I did take him up on the syrup de cassis, and I found it actually kind of refreshing. Something like that. There's all kinds of different ways that Lamb would have reacted to Poirot if Lamb had actually been a long-term friend of Poirot. So, little jarring, I'll say, for that. There's even this very weird section about little more than halfway through the book where Poirot basically spends 2 or 3 pages waxing eloquently, not even eloquently, just waxing on about various mystery authors by name. He mentions several English and several American mystery authors, kind of talks about the English versus American style. It's very meta, and Poirot books are not usually that meta. I don't know why Christie decided to do that in this book, but it was kind of one of the last books, so maybe that's why, to kind of close things down and say, oh, Poirot knows about all the different mystery authors, but Poirot's a detective, not a reader of detective stories. And so, I don't know, we haven't gotten the impression that he's an avid reader at any point in any of the other stories that I've read from, with Poirot in them. So why is he suddenly super knowledgeable about all these different mystery authors when there's no indication in the past books that he would have been, at least as far as I know. Anyway, the mystery in this book proceeds in fits and starts, and there are a ton of red herrings and false leads, and this guy's lying, but we don't know why or how, and this is this and that is that. The organization I mentioned before is a little bit odd. We're switching between Lamb and Hardcastle back and forth. There's even some parts where it's not clear whose narrative it necessarily is. We have chapters and subchapters and all kinds of weird organizational issues. And then the ending itself is, I'd call it jumbled and even a little bit weird for a Poirot novel. So, before I get to the spoiler section, what I'll say is that it's still a decent read, right? It's an Agatha Christie murder mystery, so it's worth a look. But it is not what I expected from a book that was labeled as a Hercule Poirot mystery. And so with that, let's move on to the spoiler section. I'll tell you a little bit more detail about what's happening in the book and what I thought. So here we go. All right, spoiler time. So this book begins with a woman whose name is Sheila Webb. She is called by her boss to go to a house, and she's a stenographer, basically. She's going to go to this house, and she's going to, write down something that someone has to say but doesn't have time to type themselves. When she gets there, though, the door is open. In fact, she's told that the door will probably be open. She's like, oh, yeah, the instructions that she gets are like, oh, yeah, just go in. I'll be there. If I'm out, I'll be out. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Just go in and take a seat in the living room, and I'll be with you shortly, kind of thing. So she goes there, she knocks on the door, no one answers. She remembers that she was told to just go in, so she tests the doorknob, she goes in, it's unlocked, and she walks into this room, which is the living room, or whatever they call it in Britain, right? And there's nobody there, except for the body of a dead man, which I guess is a little redundant. There's a dead man. Now, as soon as she finds this dead man, before she can even really react, the woman who owns the house, Miss Pebmarsh, appears. She comes in through the front door, and Sheila is like, "Hey, be careful where you're walking. You're gonna step on him." And because it's obvious as soon as Sheila sees Miss Pebmarsh that Miss Pebmarsh is blind. So Sheila freaks out. She runs out of the house screaming, and she lands or bounds into, not the arms of, but the shoulder of Colin Lamb, who happens to be walking around looking for a particular address in the area. We'll get more into that in a minute. He kind of tries to settle her down a little bit, goes in, sees the dead body, talks to Pebmarsh, and says, "Okay, I'm going to go to the police box down the street. I'm going to call them. They're going to be here. We'll get this all dealt with." Seems kind of. It's not very mysterious at this point, but the mysteries suddenly appear fairly quickly. First off, nobody seems to know who this old guy was. They even go to the trouble of very carefully describing his face to Miss Pebmarsh, and she's like, "I've never heard of a man, I've never seen," because Miss Pebmarsh hasn't always been blind. She became blind several years ago, and she's like, I've never been acquainted with a man who was that blind. Not that blind, but who looked like that. I haven't had any, salesmen come to the door recently or anything like that. I wasn't expecting anyone. Sheila Webb doesn't know who he is either. Hardcastle appears. He's the person that Colin Lamb calls. And they basically take a picture of the dead man's face after kind of smoothing him out a little bit, and they start showing it to everybody around, and everyone's like, "I've never seen this guy before in my life." And so things are getting a little bit weird. In addition, there's a bunch of clocks in the room that appear there when the dead body is there. I think 4 of them. And they're all set to a particular time, which is 4:13. And they're like, what do these clocks mean? Why are they here? How did they get here? Miss Pebmarsh says that she doesn't know she's never seen those clocks before. She didn't buy them. She didn't bring them. And so, what the hell, right? So we have a fairly decent mystery to start. A mystery man dead, No one knows why he was there. He has a card in his pocket which gives like a name and a business, an insurance business, and they trace that, and the address doesn't exist, and the insurance business doesn't exist, and so presumably the name isn't the name of this guy; it's someone else. So the first half of the book commences, and most of it is kind of fairly standard police procedural stuff, where Hardcastle and Colin Lamb are talking to Miss Pebmarsh's neighbors. And she lives on, it's called Wilbraham Crescent. It's a street where there's houses, and each house has a house on back of it, so like backyards butt up against each other, and then there's rows of them, and they kind of form a crescent, and then the road kind of curls back around and has the other side of it as well. And so there's a lot of like, oh, did you see anything? Oh, no, I didn't see anything. Did you see anything? Oh, I might have seen something. And then, well, no, I probably didn't, kind of thing. There's a lot of interviewing of these neighbors. And this takes up a good chunk of the book because there's at least, I think, 4 different neighbors. We have, and the cool thing about it, I guess, is that we get a lot of, because I just did that review of the Inspector Imanishi Investigates book, where that book was full of like interesting Japanese cultural artifacts. This is kind of full of interesting-ish English or British artifacts from the same time, cultural-wise. So we have this retired couple where one of them was a math professor and the other one is kind of his sister, not a couple, I'm sorry, it's his sister, right? So we have a retired math professor and his sister who are living together, and she's kind of, the head of the household, and he just likes to garden, basically. We have a crazy cat lady. We have a wife whose husband is traveling abroad and she doesn't know where he is or when he's coming back. And we have a woman who, her kids are on holiday, and so there's a bunch of clamor and screaming and action going on at the house, which is not just annoying her and tiring her out, but also, an issue of gossip among the neighbors. So kind of a nice, pretty calm, but not particularly, not like a particularly intriguing group of people. They're just kind of normal people, as far as you can tell. Now, what happens after we get to there is that Christie drops on us a bit of a bombshell, which probably we could have implied somewhat, but the exact reason wasn't really clear. So at the start of the book, Colin Lamb is walking around looking for an address, and the reason, of course, is that. The reason is that he's some kind of an international spy catcher a man of intrigue, basically. And so now we have this fairly weird murder mystery, but right into the middle of it plops this Cold War intrigue, and it muddles everything up even worse than it already was. We were already grasping for clues, but the fact that some of these people might be spies or something is even more confusing and messes everything up, because now everybody could be lying, and it wouldn't be because they're lying to avoid being caught up in this murder mystery, but it could be that they're lying because they're actually a Soviet spy or something. So this is an element that makes the story a little bit more confusing, but not confusing in a way that is like typical for what I would call like the murder mystery genre, right? You generally want to have the focus be somewhere, and by plopping in this completely unrelated Cold War intrigue issue, you muddle things more than they need to be muddled, and kind of, I could see why a reader in seeing that happen would just kind of give up. Oh, I can't trust what anyone's saying anymore. All of my evidence that I thought I had is now garbage. So, and now there's not just one motive that I have to deal with, but a completely different motive off to the side that, people are going to be, that whoever is dealing with this motive is going to have to be on guard anyway. So, it's one of those things where it's a neat idea, but at the same time, it complicates things to the degree that the average person is going to be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to read this as a book now. It's not a mystery anymore because I'm not even going to try. There's one really great moment. So I was mentioning earlier there's a woman with her kids on holiday, right? And Detective Hardcastle goes to interview her. And then when he's done, and there's this great moment where, she says, "Okay, boys, you get out of here. The inspector is going to talk with me." And the kids don't want to leave. They're like, "No, we want to stay and hear what's going on." And Hardcastle kind of takes a strong stance. And he says, he basically just stands up, goes to the door, points, and says, "Out." And the kids go out, and he closes the door, and he continues his interview with this woman. Then we get an even cooler little interaction where Hardcastle, after he's done interviewing this woman, he goes and talks to the boys themselves. And he says, you guys have been, spraying water at the crazy cat lady's cats, and stuff like that. You guys have been getting up to mischief. You guys have been going into different yards and stuff like that, crawling through holes in fences. Have you found anything? And the kids are like, there's kind of this short period where the kids are trying to figure out whether he's going to kind of snitch on them, basically. But then after that, after they kind of decide that he's trustworthy, they bring out a handkerchief that's all knotted up, and they open it up, and inside there's a bunch of little things. And Hardcastle, who up to this point hasn't really shown like compassion or anything about like any significant kind of emotion, he not only talks to the kids and kind of humors them a little bit, but he takes like a little piece of colored glass that they found, which has nothing to do with the mystery, and he says, "Oh, this might be interesting. Thank you, boys, you helped me out. Try to keep this all secret." And the kids, are obviously like super impressed and super, happy to be of help. And so they're like, "Yeah, we'll be quiet about it," and yada, yada, yada. It's a really great moment in an otherwise kind of mediocre book. And like, I really like that moment in the book. It's just fantastic. So now we know that Colin Lamb is some kind of spy catcher. Now we know that this murder has a bunch of weird things that are going on, weird circumstances around it. As the mystery goes on, we get more and more layers of red herrings and lies, and people who claim they saw something when they didn't, and people who didn't see something but claim that they did, people who identify this man as this person, people who identify the same man as somebody else, all kinds of weird, stuff that kind of muddles the mystery up and just makes it kind of a grab bag, honestly. So the first thing that they were hoping that would happen is that they would get an identification from the dental records of the man, or his face, or, something that was on his person, his clothing, laundry marks, that kind of stuff. And all of those trails go completely cold. While I'm mentioning the dead man, there's actually, I mentioned this earlier, but there's actually illustrations in the particular copy that I read. Not the one at the library, I think, but the one that I read on Archive has these weird, kind of creepy Terry Gilliam style illustrations, like the Monty Python guy. And for whatever reason, these are inserted into the book, and they make it very hard to take things seriously because it's the illustrations are so goofy looking. It's just a personal issue that I had with a particular copy I was reading, but what ends up happening is that they gather all the evidence that they can. They kind of find themselves at a dead end. And Colin Lamb takes all the evidence that they have in written form, and he brings it over to Hercule Poirot's place and basically plops it in front of him and says, "What do you think?" And Poirot goes into this long thing about various mystery writers, which is a little bit out of place. In fact, Poirot is oddly whimsical in this book. He ends up reciting a part from Alice in Wonderland, and then some other kind of like unknown nursery rhyme that I've never heard. Poirot is not in his element in this book. He's a little bit outside of what you expect from Poirot. Now, as they start looking through this evidence and as they start gathering more information, they discover that Sheila Webb, the woman who found the body, is actually the illegitimate child of some unknown people. And so we get this idea that, maybe her mother's involved, maybe her father's involved. She was told that they're both dead, that they both died in an accident when she was a baby, but they're both still alive, presumably. We end up with a character who works with Sheila Webb. Her name is Edna Brent. She is like wandering around in the middle part of the book, and she's like hinting at people that she has a clue, but she's not very smart about it. And they actually mention it in the book, like, she doesn't look like she's very bright. Like, she looks like she questions her own conclusions a lot. But instead of being patient and saying, oh, I need to talk to the inspector, she kind of like walks away and goes over here and goes over there, and she's kind of talking to herself about, oh, this doesn't make sense. This couldn't possibly be right. But of course, she doesn't tell us anything enough to tell exactly what she's talking about. But this is happening, and then all of a sudden they find her body in a phone booth, basically, and they're like, oh, now we have a second corpse, and we still don't know who did it. Another thing that happens is that Colin Lamb starts to get romantically interested in Sheila Webb herself. This subplot is not handled especially well, but it does serve to muddle things even more, because there's a question now of, is Lamb covering up for her, or is Lamb being blind to some clue that he's getting from what she's saying, or is he asking her the wrong questions or something like that? That's another thing, actually. When Lamb is talking to Poirot, Poirot is constantly complaining that Lamb is not doing things right. He's like, oh, you didn't ask the right questions. You didn't ask about this. You didn't ask about that. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You didn't go see this person. You asked this person questions rather than getting into a conversation with them. It's one of those things where, well, gee then, Poirot, maybe you should, get off your butt and go look around because you've done it in the past. Poirot is not a Nero Wolfe character, right? I love Nero Wolfe, but Poirot is notable because he's not Nero Wolfe. He's, an intellectual detective, but he also goes around places and talks to people and has his own mannerisms that are fun and interesting and charming, and we get so little of that in this book that it just makes me angry. Then we get another clue where the body is identified, the body of the first dead man, and then a couple of minutes later, they dash the whole thing off to the side and say, no, that's not who he really was, kind of thing, and she's lying, and then she gets killed. It's kind of ridiculous at this point. There's now 3 bodies, and somehow nobody saw anything. It's a little bit hard to believe, honestly. Lamb hands off another big stack of information to Poirot, and then Lamb is like, oh, I'm on the trail of this spy. I have to leave the country, and I'll be back in a little while. Hardcastle goes through and does some more interviews with people and tries to follow up on some more stuff. And then finally, Lamb comes back. He has a few conversations with people. He has there's a whole chapter dedicated to, he's standing outside of the house where the first man was murdered. And he looks up and he sees a big, apartment building across the street. And he looks up and he sees a little girl with opera glasses up there looking out of a window. And there's an entire chapter dedicated to his conversation with her, which is nice and fun and happy and interesting. But, it doesn't help at all, which is, at this point, I was getting kind of infuriated. I'm like, give me something that I can use that isn't, suspect in some significant way. And I don't believe anything that anyone has said in this book so far. So what am I supposed to do about trying to solve the mystery? And then all of a sudden, Colin Lamb wakes up the next morning, or some morning, and he has a note. It's like, meet me here at this particular place. And the room number is the same number as the clocks were set to, 413. And so he goes to this hotel and says, knock 3 times. And he knocks 3 times. And the door opens, and freaking Poirot is standing there. And Lamb is like, why did you get me here this way? You know who I am, and I know who you are. There's no reason to do this kind of theatrical stuff. And Poirot can be theatrical, but not in this way, where he's oh, I'm the murderer. You're gonna talk to you in some cheesy hotel. That's not the way that Poirot acts. And so it turns out that Poirot has called both Lamb and Hardcastle there, and basically Poirot, plunk, just drops the solution in their lap. And he's like, this is who the guy was, this is why he was killed, this is who killed him, this is, who he knew, and this is who he didn't know, and this is why he was killed. And it turns out, number one, the victim isn't who we were led to believe he is. Which you can do in a mystery and still have it work. But in this particular case, when I was so muddled, telling me, oh yeah, this guy's this guy, and then saying, well, maybe he's not this, maybe he's this guy, but the person who said he was this guy, he's not her husband, he's someone else's husband, and she's talking on some other person's behalf or something, right? But it turns out this guy's someone completely different. It turns out that almost all of the clues were complete red herrings. It turns out that most of the reasoning behind the mystery involves people who don't even appear in the book. like, the actual solution of the mystery involves people who are off in Canada, and, like, they have a connection to the dead man, and they have connections to two of the characters, but we never knew that these people existed except for possibly one couple of words, minor kind of contradictory line in a statement somewhere in the first third of the book that, like, oh yeah, that's the answer. And it's like, what? Okay, I guess. It is very, very close to breaking one of the cardinal rules of a murder mystery, which is to have, it would be breaking the rules to have the murderer be a character who's not introduced, right? That would be breaking the rules. In this case, it's not that the man it's not that the murderer wasn't introduced. And it's not even that the victim wasn't introduced. It's that the victim is there for reasons that were not introduced, which doesn't quite break the rules, but it is damn close. And it is not the same. It's not the kind of, like, clever, twisty thing that you expect from Agatha Christie novels. It's just not. It's not really clever, even. It's just like, oh yeah, I suspected that this guy was related to this, and that means that these two people are related even though they don't know it, and yada, yada, yada. It's very weird, and not a very satisfying solution, but it's not even over yet. Because once they figure out who the murderer is, we're still left with the second side plot, which is Colin Lamb's spy hunting thing. And then we get a conclusion for that, because Lamb gets an idea off of something that Hardcastle writes on a piece of paper while they're talking with Poirot that tells him, oh, this is the answer to the mystery, which practically anyone could have told you based on a piece of evidence they give us early in the book. It's like a cut-off piece of paper where there's some stuff scribbled on it, right? So suddenly Lamb is like, oh, that's what this paper meant. And he goes and he captures the spy. And then it's not very clear where he gets the information. Okay, because the piece of paper that he had at the beginning of the story, if you do the right thing to it, it becomes clear which address it's talking about. But it doesn't give any details about who the spy is, or why the spy is doing what they're doing, or, like, what their methods are. There's none of that. And so Colin Lamb goes to the house where the spy is, and he basically plonks down into the spy's lap, and, like, oh yeah, this is your method, and this is who you're getting information to, and this is what happened here, and this is why I had this clue, and yada yada yada, and all of this is, like, almost out of the blue to the reader as well. And then, for no reason that I can make clear out of what was in the book, he's like, oh yeah, and also I'm going to stay here, and the police, not the police, but like the MI6, I'll call it, right? MI6 will be here in 2 hours, and I'm going to stay here and make sure no one touches any evidence, but you can go, which is a really weird reaction for him to have to this particular spy, especially a spy that, has what's the word? Who has thwarted him for so many days. And then the spy sits down and says, no, I'll stay here and be caught. And then the book ends. And you're like, what? Huh? It's... if I were to take it upon myself to try to mess around with this story, I would make the spy solution the one that gets revealed first, and have something in that lead to the solution of the murder mystery, which is the primary mystery, right? Colin Lamb is not a character that we've seen in a million books. We don't care that much about him. There should be more Poirot. There should be more Poirot talking to people. There should be more Poirot doing Poirot things for a Hercule Poirot mystery. And yet there's practically none of it. We get to see him 3 times, and then the story ends. And you're just like, I mean, it's a clever idea. The solution was there, and I didn't see it, and I didn't figure it out. But at the same time, like, just the pure volume of red herrings and, like, oh, this is said, but it's not true, is so great that, like, it's like you kind of just give up, and you're just like, I'm just going to read the book and see what happens, and enjoy Agatha Christie's writing, which is excellent as usual. But, like, I don't know. It's one of those things where you're just like, this wasn't a particularly satisfying mystery. Anyway. I guess let's finish up the spoiler section and move on to the conclusion. Okay, in conclusion, this is a pretty decent mystery. Like in the spoiler section, I kind of feel like I was down on it quite a bit, but like it's still an Agatha Christie murder mystery. It's still got a lot of good points to it. It's still got a lot of interesting mystery elements for you to kind of play around with in your mind. It's still written extremely well because Agatha Christie is a master of the craft, and I'm not going to claim that her writing is bad in any way. I might nitpick at some of the elements that she chooses to include in the story, and when she tries to change genres, like in Destination Unknown, I might say, she's not very good at the spy thriller stuff. She's just not. But for the mystery portion of the book, her writing is solid and competent. The double voice structure, where half the time we're listening to Colin Lamb and half the time we're listening to Hardcastle, is surprisingly well done in this book. At no point did I feel like I was confused about who I was really listening to. There are some points where the narrator doesn't seem to really be either of them, which can be like, it's not confusing, but it's a little bit jarring at times. I'll put it that way. But both of the different characters' tones that we're getting in the book for their narratives, they both work well, and they're both fairly consistent. And as I mentioned in the spoiler section, like Lamb is kind of like an okay character, but Hardcastle actually has some moments that really make him shine as a character, and not just as a character, but also like in his role as a detective inspector. And so there's some stuff in the book that really made me happy to read. We get a lot of British cultural mannerisms from the late 1950s, which is kind of like Imanishi, but for a different company or different country. And of course, the British mannerisms are much more familiar to me, even as an American. But the thing about it is that the British Imanishi Investigates was very serious and sincere about the way it presented Japanese cultural mores, right? It was very much about like, oh yeah, if you go somewhere and you are a tourist there and you come back, you bring a souvenir for someone. This is the way that you talk to a person who is your subordinate. This is the way that you talk to a person who is your superior, yada, yada, yada. And those kinds of elements of Japanese culture they have a definite foreign element compared to what, me, just a random American guy, is used to. In this book, the British stuff is treated, it's there, right? We get to see various types of British people and the way that they live their lives and the way that they respond to other people's, statements and stuff like that. So we get some of that, but at the same time, it's treated in kind of like a mild sitcom kind of way, right? It's not as serious as the Imanishi book was about the cultural points. And in fact, the fact that the characters are slightly caricatured isn't helped by the very goofy illustrations that appeared in the book version that I read. Now this is a story that, as a mystery, is replete with false leads, which isn't technically a problem. The double mystery structure makes things a lot more confusing, which is okay too. However, the solution for the murder mystery in this book gets very close to breaking a cardinal rule of murder mystery, and I think that it's something worth noticing and maybe mentioning for avid readers of murder mysteries. You're going to find something that is a little bit that it's not quite breaking the rules, but it's a little bit outside the bounds of what you expect the author to do to make a mystery mysterious. For a book that is advertised as a Hercule Poirot mystery, we don't get enough Poirot. I want more Poirot. He is treated almost like a mystery-solving vending machine. Lamb goes in, plops a bunch of stuff on his lap, goes away, comes back, gets some information, plops some more stuff on his lap, goes away, comes back, plop. Poirot is like, you have given me enough information to solve this mystery. Plop. Here is the solution to the mystery. Part of the fun of these books, of Poirot books, is seeing Poirot's reactions to things and seeing the way that he kind of like attacks a corner of someone's perspective on what they ought to be saying and what they ought not to be saying. And being nearby as a reader, as a viewer, while he kind of exercises his little gray cells is fun, because he talks to himself, or he talks to the people around him who also want to solve the mystery, and that banter makes for a very fun, like, humanization of the elements of the story. But we don't get that much of that here. We get very little of it. And in fact, Poirot's a little weird in this story because he's reciting, Alice in Wonderland and weird nursery rhymes. Like, that is not the way that Poirot generally acts. And it would be weird for Poirot to... I mean, it feels weird for Poirot to suddenly be an avid reader. Not just of mysteries, but apparently also of Alice in Wonderland. And then apparently British nursery rhymes. Like, it's very weird in that sense. There's that romance subplot that I mentioned that kind of feels tacked on. Like, it's there. It's not like, a pain to read, or it's not offensive or anything like that. But it just feels kind of thin and tacked on and not really like it was thought out well and given a good, like, place in the story. What it serves to do is it serves to muddle things even more by making one of the characters possibly either, one of the main characters, one of the narrative characters, Colin Lamb, it either makes him into a co-conspirator, possibly, or possibly the culprit, or possibly someone who just doesn't have what's needed in him to, to ask the right questions of the woman that he's interested in. And so that kind of also makes the mystery even more muddled, even after the double mystery structure, which is already very, very confusing. I mean, this is one of those books where Agatha Christie decided to use international intrigue to kind of season the murder mystery, kind of salt on there. And honestly, it kind of makes the book feel muddled and unfocused compared to a really good Christie murder mystery where things are where you see the hammer starting to drop here and here and here, and this is a point, and this is a point, and Poirot is like, oh, but what about this? And there's all kinds of, in a really good Poirot novel, there's all kinds of cool elements like that, and they just don't really show up in this book, which, it's very, very late in Agatha Christie's writing career. So, and again, maybe she decided that she really wanted to put in all this international intrigue stuff, but it just doesn't really work very well. So yeah, that's what I've got to say about The Clocks by Agatha Christie. It's a good murder mystery. It will keep you interested. It is well written. It has an engaging tone. It has some very cool characters. It has some weird unserious bits, and it is, I think it is not a reasonable thing to do to call it a Hercule Poirot mystery, because he appears in probably 20 pages of the book or less. It has some strange elements, and it almost breaks the rules, but doesn't quite. But it's still a decent read, and you'll still have fun reading it, especially if you like Agatha Christie stuff. So, yeah, that's what I've got for The Clocks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll put a link in the description to where you can read the book for free. And, yeah, have a good week, and I'll see you next time.